My daughter cornered me in the hallway of my own home, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Mom, you're losing it. You're mentally gone, and everyone can see it." She waved a crumpled receipt in my face like evidence in a courtroom. $17 for organic tomatoes? When we're struggling to pay the mortgage? You're completely disconnected from reality. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood there in my faded housecoat, gray hair unwashed for 3 days, looking every bit the confused old woman she painted me to be. What she didn't know was that while she worried about $17, I had 300 million reasons to smile. But I kept my mouth shut, let her think what she wanted, because sometimes the best defense is letting people underestimate you completely. That night, as I listened to her on the phone, telling her brother how, "Mom's really gone this time," I made a decision that would turn their entire world upside down. The next morning, I walked into the bank wearing my best dress and asked to speak with the private wealth manager. It was time to stop playing the helpless old lady. My name is Yvonne Garcia, though everyone's called me Vonnie since I was 5 years old. At 73, I've lived through enough decades to know that people see what they want to see. And right now, my family saw a declining old woman who couldn't handle her own finances. If only they knew the truth. The morning it all started to unravel, I was sitting at my kitchen table in Riverside, California, sorting through what my daughter Melissa called my hoarding papers. She'd been after me for months to clean up this mess and get organized before it's too late. The irony wasn't lost on me. These weren't just random papers scattered by a forgetful mind. Every document, every receipt, every seemingly meaningless scrap had its place in a puzzle she couldn't begin to understand. Melissa burst through my front door without knocking, her heels clicking against the linoleum like an angry metronome. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she had all the answers. Her perfectly styled blonde hair never moved, even in the California wind. And her designer handbag probably cost more than most people made in a month. She worked as a real estate agent in Newport Beach, successful enough to afford nice things but not wealthy enough to understand real money. "Mom, we need to talk." She didn't even say good morning, just planted herself across from me and started rifling through my papers like she owned them. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Peterson said at your last appointment." Dr. Peterson was my physician, a kind man in his 50s who'd been treating me for the past decade. During my last visit, I'd made the mistake of forgetting his name momentarily, calling him Dr. Patterson instead. It was a simple slip, the kind anyone might make, but Melissa had seized on it like a smoking gun. "He didn't say anything concerning," I replied carefully, watching her sort my documents into piles she deemed important and trash. If she only knew what some of those papers were worth. "Mom, you called him the wrong name. You forgot where you parked at the grocery store last week. Yesterday, I found milk in your cupboard instead of the refrigerator." She leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "These aren't normal senior moments. This is cognitive decline." I wanted to laugh. The milk incident was because I'd been distracted reading a financial report on my phone about one of my investment portfolios. The parking situation happened because I'd been on a conference call with my offshore account manager, discussing currency fluctuations that would affect my holdings. But explaining that would mean revealing everything, and I wasn't ready for that conversation. "I'm fine, Melissa, just a little forgetful sometimes." I reached for a stack of papers she'd marked as trash, but she pulled them away. "See? This is exactly what I mean. You're attached to literal garbage." She held up a receipt from 1987. "Why are you keeping receipts from 35 years ago?" This isn't normal behavior. That particular receipt was from the day I'd bought my first stock shares under a false identity. It represented the beginning of an empire she couldn't fathom. But to her, it was just an old piece of paper from a woman who couldn't let go of the past. "Maybe I should stay here for a few days," she continued, "just to keep an eye on things. Make sure you're eating properly, taking your medications." The thought of Melissa hovering around my house, going through my belongings with her judgmental eyes, made my stomach clench. She had no idea how close she was to stumbling onto something that would change everything. Hidden throughout this modest ranch house were documents, codes, and access information for accounts spread across 12 countries. Safety deposit box keys disguised as spare house keys. phone numbers for private bankers memorized and hidden in what looked like grocery lists. That's not necessary, I said firmly. I can take care of myself. She studied my face with the expression of someone trying to reason with a child. Mom, you're 73 years old. You live alone in a house that's falling apart. Your hair looks like you haven't combed it in days, and you're wearing the same clothes you had on yesterday. I glanced down at my worn sweater and faded jeans. She was right about my appearance, but that was by design. Looking like a struggling elderly woman on a fixed income was the perfect camouflage. My neighbors saw me clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores, never suspecting that I could buy their entire subdivision without feeling the pinch. I think we should talk to Marcus about this, she said, pulling out her phone. Marcus was my son, 2 years older than Melissa, and twice as concerned about my declining mental state. He lived in Phoenix with his wife Carmen and their 2 teenage kids, but he called every week to check on me, each conversation laced with worry about my episodes. Please don't involve your brother in this, I said, but she was already dialing. Marcus? It's me. I'm at Mom's house, and I think we need to have that conversation we talked about. She walked into the living room, her voice dropping to what she thought was a whisper but was clearly audible from the kitchen. She's gotten worse. The house is a disaster. She looks like she's not taking care of herself, and she's hoarding papers like their treasure. I closed my eyes and rubbed my temples. They meant well, I knew that. In their minds, they were loving children trying to protect their aging mother from herself. But their concern was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who I really was and what I was capable of. The truth was, I'd been playing a very long game for over 4 decades. Back in 1981, when I was 30 and divorced with 2 young children, I'd made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. Instead of remarrying or depending on anyone else for security, I would create my own safety net. A safety net so vast and well hidden that even if everything else fell apart, my family would be protected. It started small. I took a job as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. Nothing glamorous, but it taught me how money moved and how easy it was to make it disappear and reappear in different places. I studied every financial magazine I could get my hands on, learned about offshore accounts and shell companies, about cryptocurrency before most people knew it existed. The genius was in the gradual accumulation and the careful concealment. I never lived above my apparent means. While I could have afforded a mansion in Beverly Hills, I stayed in my modest Riverside home, driving used cars and shopping sales. Every windfall was carefully laundered through legitimate businesses I'd established under various names and identities. To anyone watching, including my own children, I was a single mother scraping by on bookkeeping jobs and later, a small pension. But the reality,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
was that Yvonne Garcia, grandmother and apparent dementia candidate, controlled a financial empire worth more than most small countries' GDP. Real estate holdings across 3 continents, technology stocks bought when companies were just startups in garages, cryptocurrency purchased when Bitcoin was trading for pennies, art and precious metals stored in climate-controlled facilities under names that couldn't be traced back to the little old lady in Riverside who forgot where she parked her car. Melissa returned to the kitchen, her expression grave. Marcus is driving down this weekend. We think it's time to discuss your living situation. My living situation. Code for moving me into assisted living, where I'd be monitored 24 hours a day, where every financial transaction would be scrutinized, where the careful web I'd spent decades weaving would unravel in a matter of days. There's nothing wrong with my living situation, I said, but even I could hear how weak my voice sounded. Mom, look around. Really look. She gestured at the cluttered counters, the stack of mail I hadn't sorted, the dishes in the sink. You're overwhelmed. You can't keep up with basic household tasks. And financially. She trailed off, but I knew where she was heading. What about financially? When's the last time you balanced your checkbook? Do you even know how much money you have in your account? She pulled out a chair and sat down across from me, her voice gentling. I know this is hard to hear, but we're worried you're going to get scammed or make a mistake that costs you everything. If she only knew that while she was lecturing me about financial responsibility, I was mentally calculating the interest accumulating on accounts she couldn't imagine. The everything she was worried about me losing was barely a fraction of my actual worth. I manage my money just fine, I said. Really? Because last month you bought 3 bottles of the same vitamins because you forgot you already had them. You've been getting late notices from the electric company because you keep forgetting to pay the bill. And don't get me started on that $17 receipt for tomatoes. The tomato incident. I'd been distracted that day, having just received confirmation that a cryptocurrency investment I'd made 5 years earlier had increased in value by 4,000%. $17 for organic tomatoes seemed laughably insignificant when I'd just made several $1,000,000, but I couldn't explain that to the cashier or to my daughter, who'd accompanied me to the store and nearly had a heart attack at the register. Maybe I should take over your finances for a while, Melissa continued. Just temporarily, until you're feeling more like yourself. I could set up automatic payments for your bills, maybe consolidate your accounts to make things simpler. The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Melissa taking over my finances would be like handing a child the nuclear codes. Within days, she'd stumble across transactions and account balances that would require explanations I wasn't prepared to give. The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the cryptocurrency wallets. It would all come tumbling out in the worst possible way. No, I said, perhaps too quickly. I mean, that's not necessary. I can handle my own affairs. She studied my face with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Mom, you're being defensive. That's another sign that Dr. Peterson warned us about. When people start losing their cognitive abilities, they often become secretive and paranoid about money. Secretive and paranoid. If she only knew how accurate that description was, though not for the reason she thought. I'm not being secretive, I lied. I just value my independence. Independence is one thing, but stubbornness is another. She reached across the table and took my hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. We love you, Mom. Marcus and I, we just want to make sure you're safe and taken care of. We've watched you struggle since Dad died, and we hate seeing you worry about money when we could help. My ex-husband Richard had died 6 years earlier from a heart attack. We'd been divorced for over 30 years by then, but his death had affected me more than I'd expected. Not from lingering romantic feelings, but because he'd been one of the few people who truly knew me during those early years when I was building my empire. He'd never known the full extent of what I was doing, but he'd known I was up to something beyond my day job. I don't struggle with money, I said carefully. Mom, you live on, $1,200 a month from Social Security? Your pension from the county is barely enough to cover utilities. We know you're proud, but there's no shame in accepting help from your children. $1,200 a month. The amount I spent on fresh flowers for my various safe deposit boxes to maintain the illusion that they were being regularly accessed by a little old lady who liked to keep mementos in secure storage. I have savings, I said, which was technically true, though it barely scratched the surface. How much? The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended, but she didn't take it back. I met her eyes steadily. Enough. That's not an answer, Mom. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. You're being evasive about basic financial questions. It's like you don't trust us, your own children, to help you. Trust. The word hung in the air between us like a challenge. Did I trust my children? I loved them desperately, would have done anything for them, had literally spent decades accumulating wealth to ensure they'd never want for anything. But trust them with the truth? That was a different question entirely. Marcus and Melissa were good people, but they were also products of their generation. They shared everything on social media, discussed their personal business with friends and colleagues, lived their lives in the open. The idea of keeping secrets, of maintaining multiple identities across decades, would be foreign to them. And more importantly, they wouldn't understand why it had been necessary. When I'd started building my hidden empire, women couldn't even get credit cards without a husband's signature. The financial world was designed to keep people like me, divorced mothers with limited resources, dependent on others for survival. I'd refused to accept that fate, but I'd also understood that the system wasn't going to change overnight. So I'd learned to work within it, around it, and sometimes against it. It's not about trust, I said finally. It's about dignity. Melissa's expression softened. Mom, there's nothing undignified about accepting help when you need it. You raised us to be independent and successful. Let us take care of you now. The irony was overwhelming. She wanted to take care of me because she thought I was failing, but the truth was that I was more financially secure than she could ever dream of being. I owned the office building where she worked, though she didn't know it. The company that managed her retirement fund was partially owned by one of my shell corporations. Her children's college funds, which she and her husband stressed about constantly, could be paid for with what I made in interest in a single day. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm not ready to give up my independence just yet. She sighed, the sound heavy with frustration and worry. Marcus is going to want to see your bank statements when he gets here, maybe your tax returns from the last few years, just to get a clear picture of your financial situation. Bank statements. Tax returns. The documents she was asking for would show exactly what she expected to see. An elderly woman living on a fixed income, spending carefully, occasionally making small mistakes but nothing alarming. What they wouldn't show were the dozens of other accounts, the investment portfolios, the business holdings that existed in names that couldn't be traced back to Yvonne Garcia. Those are private documents, I said. Mom, we're your children. We're not trying to steal from you or judge you. We just want to help. She paused, studying my face. Unless there's something you're not telling us? The question hung in the air like a trap. There was everything I wasn't telling them. 4 decades of careful planning, strategic investments, and calculated risks that had turned a desperate single mother into one of the wealthiest women in California. But how could I explain that without sounding exactly like what they already suspected? I was a confused old woman living in a fantasy. There's nothing I'm hiding, I said, which was both completely true and utterly false. She looked at me for a long moment, then gathered up the papers she'd been sorting. I'm going to help you organize these, whether you want me to or not. And when Marcus gets here, we're going to have a serious family meeting about your future. My future. They thought they were planning my future, making decisions about where I would live and how I would spend my remaining years. They had no idea that I'd been planning all of our futures for longer than they'd been adults. As Melissa worked her way through my papers, discarding what she deemed worthless and organizing what she thought was important, I watched decades of careful work being sorted by someone who couldn't begin to understand its significance. Every receipt, every seemingly random note, every scrap of paper she was throwing away was part of a system so complex and well-designed that it had fooled everyone, including the IRS, for 40 years. But maybe it was time. Maybe after all these years of playing the part of struggling grandmother, it was time to show them who I really was. The question was whether they were ready for the truth, and whether revealing it would destroy the very relationships I'd spent my life trying to protect. As my daughter continued her organizing, muttering about my hoarding tendencies and cognitive decline, I made a decision. When Marcus arrived this weekend, when they sat me down for their intervention about my mental state and financial incompetence, I would give them exactly what they were asking for. I would show them the truth about their mother's money, all $300 million of it. The rest of that week passed in a blur of Melissa's concerned hovering. She stayed every night, sleeping in Marcus's old room and treating me like I might wander off or forget to turn off the stove. She made my meals, sorted my mail, and watched me with the careful attention of someone monitoring a patient. Wednesday morning, she found me in my home office, what she called my paper room, sitting at my desk with my laptop open. I'd been checking on some cryptocurrency investments, but I quickly minimized the screen when she appeared in the doorway. Mom, what are you doing up so early? She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was barely 6 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, I said, which was true. The knowledge that everything was about to change had kept me awake most of the night. She moved closer, trying to see my computer screen. What were you looking at? Just some news websites, I lied smoothly. I like to read the morning headlines. She frowned, clearly skeptical. You know how to use the internet? The question would have been insulting if it weren't so perfectly aligned with the image I'd cultivated. To Melissa, I was a technologically challenged senior citizen who still used a flip phone and asked for help setting up my DVD player. She had no idea that I'd been one of the early adopters of online trading, that I'd purchased domain names in the 1990s that were now worth millions, or that I maintained encrypted communication with financial advisors around the world. I know how to click on things, I said with what I hoped sounded like elderly pride in a minor accomplishment. She sat down on the edge of my desk, her expression softening with what I recognized as pity. Mom, I've been thinking about what we discussed yesterday, about your finances and your living situation. And I think you might be more worried about money than you're letting on. It's okay to be scared about the future, about having enough to live on, but you don't have to face it alone. If she only knew that I wasn't scared about having enough money, I was terrified about having too much. The logistics of managing a fortune while pretending to live on Social Security were becoming increasingly complex. Every year, the balancing act became more difficult, the explanations more elaborate. I'm not scared, I said. Then why won't you let us help? Why won't you show us your financial situation so we can make sure you're okay? She leaned forward, her voice gentle but persistent. Mom, I love you. Marcus loves you. We just want to take care of you the way you took care of us. The way I took care of them. If she only knew the extent of how I was still taking care of them, how every decision I made was designed to ensure their security and their children's futures. The trust funds I'd established in their names, accessible when they turned 50, the life insurance policies that would pay out millions, the real estate holdings that would eventually transfer to them through carefully structured inheritances. You do take care of me, I said. Both of you. You call, you visit, you worry about me. That's enough. She shook her head. It's not enough, Mom. Not when we can see you struggling and we have the means to help. Struggling? The word followed me everywhere now, a label that had somehow attached itself to my carefully constructed persona. To the outside world, Yvonne Garcia was struggling. Struggling financially, struggling with her memory, struggling to maintain her independence as age crept up on her. But the woman behind that facade wasn't struggling at all. She was thriving, growing more powerful with each passing year, accumulating wealth at a rate that would have been impossible if anyone had known to pay attention. Melissa, I said carefully, what if things aren't exactly as they seem? She tilted her head, confused. What do you mean? I stared at her for a long moment, this successful, intelligent woman who thought she understood her mother's life completely. How do you tell someone that everything they believe about you is wrong? How do you reveal that the person they're trying to save is actually the one who's been saving them all along? Nothing, I said finally. Never mind. But Friday afternoon, when Marcus's familiar blue pickup truck pulled into my driveway, I knew the time for avoiding the truth was over. Through my window, I watched my son climb out of the driver's seat, tall and broad-shouldered like his father had been, his face already wearing the expression of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. Carmen emerged from the passenger side, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She was a nurse, practical and no nonsense, and I knew she'd probably come armed with medical literature about cognitive decline and assisted living facilities. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for years. In a few hours, my children would sit me down and try to convince me that I needed to give up my independence, my privacy, and my carefully guarded secrets. What they didn't know was that I was finally ready to show them exactly how mental I really was. Mental enough to hide $300 million for 4 decades. Mental enough to build an empire while everyone thought I was falling apart. And mental enough to have planned for this exact moment since before they were old enough to understand what money really meant. As I watched Marcus pull his overnight bag from the truck bed, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, I had one last evening as the confused, struggling mother they thought they knew. Tomorrow, they would meet the real Yvonne Garcia, and I couldn't wait to see their faces. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me feel energetic and hopeful. Instead, I woke with my stomach twisted in knots, knowing that today would either liberate me from decades of deception or destroy the relationships I valued most in the world. Marcus had texted the night before that they wanted to have the talk after breakfast, which meant I had maybe 2 hours before my carefully constructed world either evolved or exploded. I made coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from age or confusion as my children might assume, but from anticipation. In my bedroom closet, behind boxes of old Christmas decorations and winter coats I hadn't worn in years, sat a fireproof safe that contained documents my family had never seen. Birth certificates for identities that didn't technically exist. Passports in names that had accumulated frequent flyer miles across 6 continents. Financial statements that would make Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. But before I could reveal any of that, I needed to understand exactly what my children thought they knew about my situation. I needed to hear their concerns, their plans, their solutions for the problem they believed I represented. Only then could I decide how much truth they were ready to handle. Carmen was already in my kitchen when I emerged, efficiently preparing what looked like enough breakfast for a small army. She'd always been a caretaker, the kind of person who showed love through feeding people and making sure they took their vitamins. Her nursing background made her particularly sensitive to signs of decline in elderly patients, which meant she'd probably been studying me like a medical case since she'd arrived. "Good morning, Vonnie," she said, using the nickname that never sounded quite natural coming from her. She'd been part of our family for 15 years, but there was still a formality to our relationship that neither of us had ever quite overcome. "I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to make sure you had a good breakfast before we all sit down to talk." The phrasing was carefully chosen, I noticed. Not before we argue or before we upset you, but before we talk, as if this were going to be a pleasant family discussion rather than an intervention. "That's very thoughtful," I said, accepting the plate of scrambled eggs and toast she handed me. "Where are Marcus and Melissa?" "Taking a walk around the neighborhood." Marcus wanted to see how things have changed since he moved away. Carmen sat down across from me with her own plate, but I noticed she was mostly pushing food around rather than eating. "Vonnie, can I ask you something?" I nodded, though I suspected I already knew what was coming. "Are you happy? I mean, really happy living here by yourself, managing everything on your own?" Her voice was gentle, carefully neutral in the way nurses learn to speak when delivering difficult news. The question caught me off guard. In all my planning for this conversation, I'd prepared for questions about my memory, my finances, my ability to care for myself. I hadn't expected anyone to ask about my happiness. "That's a complicated question," I said finally. "Most important questions are." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes searching my face. "Marcus worries about you constantly. He lies awake at night wondering if you're okay, if you're lonely, if something might happen, and we wouldn't know for hours or even days." I felt a familiar pang of guilt hearing this. In all my careful planning, I'd never fully considered the emotional cost of my deception on my children. They were spending their energy worrying about problems that didn't exist, while remaining completely unaware of the empire I'd built for their benefit. "I understand his concern," I said, "but I'm not as helpless as you all seem to think." Carmen smiled, but it was the kind of smile nurses gave to patients who insisted they were fine while clearly struggling. "No one thinks you're helpless, Vonnie. But there's a difference between being independent and being isolated. And lately it seems like you're more isolated than you'd like to admit." She wasn't wrong about the isolation. The nature of my hidden life meant I couldn't form close relationships with neighbors, or join social groups where people might ask too many questions about my background or lifestyle. I'd spent decades keeping people at arm's length, maintaining the perfect balance of appearing social enough to avoid suspicion while remaining private enough to protect my secrets. "I have my routines," I said. "My garden, my reading, my volunteer work at the library," all of which were true, though the volunteer work at the library was actually how I maintained access to computers and internet connections that couldn't be traced back to my home address. Mrs. Henderson, the head librarian, probably thought I was a sweet elderly woman who enjoyed helping with their book sales. She had no idea I was using their computer lab to monitor global financial markets and communicate with investment managers across 3 time zones. "Routines are good," Carmen agreed, "but Marcus and Melissa are worried that your routines might be—" She paused, clearly searching for diplomatic language. "They're concerned that you might be having trouble keeping track of things. Important things. Important things." like the offshore account in the Cayman Islands that had generated more interest in the past month than most people made in a year. Like the cryptocurrency wallet that had increased in value by 800% since I'd last checked it. Like the real estate portfolio that now included properties in Manhattan, London, and Tokyo. Such as? I asked. Well, Melissa mentioned that you've been having trouble with bills. Missing payments, paying the same bill twice, that sort of thing. Carmen's voice remained carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern underneath. And there have been some incidents with memory that have everyone worried. The missing payments were strategic. I'd learned decades ago that appearing to struggle with mundane tasks like bill paying was an excellent way to maintain the illusion of limited resources. The elderly woman who occasionally forgot to pay her electric bill on time was clearly living paycheck to paycheck. The woman who paid that same bill from a checking account that maintained exactly the minimum balance needed to avoid fees was obviously stretched thin financially. What my family didn't know was that those late payments were deliberately calculated to maintain a specific credit score and financial profile. Every mistake was carefully planned to support the narrative of Yvonne Garcia, struggling retiree. Memory isn't what it used to be, I said, which was both true and false. My memory for important details, like account numbers and access codes, remained sharp as ever. My memory for trivial things like where I put my reading glasses or what day I'd scheduled a dentist appointment had indeed become less reliable, though I suspected that was more about having bigger things on my mind than actual cognitive decline. That's exactly what Marcus is worried about. Carmen reached across the table and touched my hand gently. He's afraid you might make a financial mistake that you can't recover from. You know, get scammed by one of those people who target elderly folks. Or forget to pay something important, or... She trailed off, but I knew where the sentence was heading. Or accidentally reveal something about your hidden assets that brings unwanted attention from the government, criminals, or family members who can't handle the truth. I'm not going to get scammed, I said firmly. How can you be sure? These people are very sophisticated. They know exactly how to target people who are vulnerable, and they're especially good at exploiting anyone who might be experiencing memory issues. If only she knew that I'd spent the past 40 years becoming an expert in exactly the kind of financial manipulation she was warning me about. The difference was that I'd been using those techniques to build wealth rather than steal it, to create security rather than exploit vulnerability. The sound of voices on my front porch announced the return of Marcus and Melissa from their neighborhood reconnaissance mission. Through the window I could see them standing on my front steps, heads bent together, in what was clearly a strategy session. They really do love you, Carmen said, following my gaze. Everything they're worried about comes from a place of wanting to protect you. I knew that was true, which made what I was about to do both easier and more difficult. Easier because I knew their motivations were pure, more difficult because I was about to shatter their understanding of who their mother was and what she was capable of. Marcus entered first, his tall frame filling the doorway in a way that reminded me of his father. At 47, he developed the kind of steady, responsible demeanor that made him excellent at his job managing construction projects, but also made him inclined to treat every family problem like a project that needed managing. "Morning, Mom," he said, bending down to kiss my cheek. "House looks good. I noticed you got the fence repaired." The fence repair had cost $300, paid for with what amounted to pocket change from one of my smaller investment accounts. But to Marcus, it probably represented a significant expense for someone living on a fixed income. Neighbor's dog kept getting into my garden, I explained. Melissa followed him in, looking like she'd spent the morning preparing for battle. She carried a manila folder that I suspected contained printouts of information about assisted living facilities, financial management services for seniors, and probably a few medical articles about cognitive decline. "Should we sit in the living room?" she suggested. "This feels like a conversation we should have somewhere comfortable." Comfortable. As if there was any way to make this conversation comfortable for anyone involved. We arranged ourselves around my living room like negotiators preparing for a difficult treaty discussion. Marcus and Carmen took the couch, while Melissa chose the chair that put her directly across from me. I remained in my favorite recliner, the one positioned so I could see both the television and the window that looked out onto my garden. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken concerns and carefully planned interventions. I could feel all three of them studying me, looking for signs of the decline they were so worried about. "Mom," Marcus finally began, his voice carrying the forced cheer of someone delivering bad news. "We wanted to talk to you about some things we've been noticing lately." "What kind of things?" Melissa opened her folder and pulled out what looked like a list. "Well, there are the memory issues we've discussed. Forgetting names, misplacing things, confusion about dates and appointments." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information for the first time rather than having anticipated this exact conversation for months. "Then there are the financial concerns," Marcus continued. "The late bill payments, the impulsive purchases, the general disorganization of your paperwork." Impulsive purchases, like the organic tomatoes that had cost $17 but had triggered this entire intervention, or the set of expensive kitchen knives I'd bought online last month, not because I needed them, but because the company that manufactured them was about to be acquired by a larger corporation, and I'd wanted to see their product quality before deciding whether to increase my investment in their parent company. "And there's the isolation factor," Carmen added gently. "You spend a lot of time alone, which isn't necessarily unhealthy, but it can make it harder to get help if you need it." I looked at each of them in turn, these three people who thought they understood my situation completely. "What exactly are you proposing?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Melissa took charge, pulling several brochures from her folder. "We've been researching some options," she said, spreading glossy pamphlets across my coffee table like a real estate agent displaying properties. "There are some really nice senior living communities in the area, places where you could have your own apartment but also have access to meal services, medical care, social activities." I picked up one of the brochures, studying the photographs of smiling elderly people playing cards and tending small gardens. "These look expensive." "That's the other thing we wanted to discuss," Marcus said. "Your finances. We think it might be time for us to take a more active role in managing your money, just to make sure everything is organized and protected." Protected? From what, I wondered. From my own supposedly declining judgment, or from the scammers and predators they were so worried about? "We're not trying to take away your independence," Melissa added quickly. "We just want to make sure you're safe and secure." Safe and secure. If they only knew how safe and secure I actually was. The woman they were trying to protect had enough liquid assets to buy every assisted living facility in Riverside County. The woman they thought needed help managing her money had a diversified portfolio that would continue generating wealth for generations. "What would that look like?" I asked. "This more active role in managing my finances?" Marcus and Melissa exchanged a glance that told me they'd discussed this extensively before arriving. "Well," Marcus said, "we thought maybe you could add one of us to your bank accounts, just as a backup. And maybe we could help you organize your important papers, make sure your bills are set up for automatic payment, that sort of thing. Adding one of them to my bank accounts." The suggestion was reasonable from their perspective, but from mine, it was terrifying. Even my legitimate bank accounts, the ones that appeared to contain only my modest Social Security income and small savings, were carefully designed to show exactly what I wanted them to show. Having Marcus or Melissa regularly monitoring those accounts would eventually lead to questions about inconsistencies, unexplained deposits, transfers that didn't quite make sense. And if they started digging deeper, if they somehow stumbled across the network of accounts and investments I'd built over 4 decades, the revelations would be catastrophic, not just financially, but emotionally. How do you explain to your children that you've been living a lie for their entire adult lives? "I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of oversight," I said carefully. "It's not oversight, Mom," Melissa said, though her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe that herself. "It's just making sure you have backup support when you need it." "What if I don't need it?" The question seemed to catch them off guard. Marcus frowned slightly, as if the possibility that I might actually be managing fine on my own hadn't occurred to him. "Mom, we've seen the signs," he said. "The confusion, the disorganization, the financial mistakes. You might not realize how much you're struggling because it's been gradual, but from the outside, it's pretty obvious that you need help." Struggling. There was that word again, following me like a shadow through every conversation about my future. I was struggling with my memory, struggling with my finances, struggling to maintain my independence. The narrative had become so embedded in their minds that they couldn't imagine any other explanation for my behavior. What if, I said slowly, the things you're interpreting as signs of decline are actually something else entirely? Carmen leaned forward, her nursing instincts probably sensing that I was about to say something significant. What do you mean? I looked around my living room, taking in the familiar furniture, the family photos on the mantel, the comfortable clutter of a life lived in one place for many years. In a few minutes, this room would never look the same to any of us. The revelations I was about to make would change everything about how my children saw me, how they understood their own histories, how they thought about their futures. What if, I continued, I've been letting you believe certain things about my situation because the truth was more complicated than I thought you were ready to handle? The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the confusion on their faces, the gradual realization that this conversation was about to take a turn none of them had anticipated. "Mom," Melissa said slowly, "what are you talking about?" I stood up from my recliner, my decision finally made. "I think it's time I showed you something." They watched me cross the room to my old oak desk, the one that had belonged to my grandmother and had sat in the same corner for 20 years. I opened the bottom drawer and removed a small key that they'd probably seen dozens of times but never thought to question. "What's that for?" Marcus asked. "My filing cabinet," I said, which was true though incomplete. It was the key to my filing cabinet, but more specifically, it was the key to the locked drawer that contained documents none of them had ever seen. I walked to the metal filing cabinet that sat in the corner of my dining room, the one they'd always assumed contained old tax returns and insurance policies. Marcus and Melissa followed me, their expressions shifting from concern to curiosity to something approaching alarm. The locked drawer opened with a soft click, revealing manila folders organized with the kind of precision that would have surprised anyone who'd seen my supposedly disorganized paperwork management. I selected 3 folders and carried them back to the coffee table, setting them down next to the assisted living brochures with ceremonial precision. Before we continue this conversation about my declining mental capacity and financial vulnerability, I said, I think you should see what you're actually dealing with. I opened the first folder and removed a bank statement. Not one of my regular checking account statements that showed modest deposits and careful spending, but a statement from a private wealth management firm that most people had never heard of. Marcus was the first to lean forward and read the numbers. I watched his face change as his brain processed what he was seeing, watched him count the digits and recount them, watched his expression shift from confusion to shock to something approaching panic. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what is this?" "That," I said calmly, "is one of my smaller accounts, the one I use for what you might call everyday expenses." The account balance showed just over $12 million. Melissa grabbed the statement from her brother's hands, her eyes scanning the numbers like she was reading a foreign language. "This can't be real. This has to be some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake," I said, opening the second folder. "This one shows my real estate holdings, current market values, rental income, appreciation projections." The real estate portfolio summary was 43 pages long and included properties across 4 countries. The total value exceeded $80 million. Carmen made a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. "Vonnie, I don't understand. How is this possible?" "The third folder," I continued, ignoring her question for the moment, "contains information about my investment portfolios. Stocks, bonds, commodities, cryptocurrency, and various business holdings." Marcus opened the third folder with hands that were visibly shaking. The summary sheet on top showed a portfolio value that exceeded $200 million. "This is insane," Melissa said, her voice rising. "Mom, where did this money come from? How long have you had it? Why didn't you tell us?" I sat back down in my recliner, suddenly feeling every one of my 73 years. The moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for decades had finally arrived, and now that it was here, I found myself surprisingly calm. The money came from 40 years of careful planning, strategic investing, and what you might call aggressive wealth accumulation, I said. "I've had various amounts of it for most of your adult lives, and I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure you could handle the truth." "Handle the truth?" Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Mom, you're sitting on a fortune worth more than most people see in 10 lifetimes, and you've been letting us worry about whether you can afford your electric bill. The electric bill is $37 a month, I said. The amount I made in interest while we've been having this conversation could pay that bill for the next several decades. The numbers were starting to sink in now. I could see them doing the mental calculations, understanding for the first time the true scope of what they were looking at. How? Carmen asked simply. It was the question I'd been expecting, the one that would require me to explain 4 decades of deception, careful planning, and financial maneuvering that had transformed a struggling single mother into one of the wealthiest people in California. It started in 1981, I began, settling back into my chair. You were 9 and 7, and we'd been on our own for 2 years since the divorce. I was working as a bookkeeper for Thompson Construction, making barely enough to cover rent and groceries, and I realized that if something happened to me, you'd have nothing. I paused, remembering those early years when every decision was driven by desperation and determination in equal measure. So I started learning about money, real money, not the paycheck-to-paycheck survival I'd been doing. I read every book I could find about investing, about building wealth, about financial strategies that most people never hear about. But Mom, Melissa interrupted, you were barely making ends meet. How could you have money to invest? I didn't initially, but I learned about other ways to accumulate wealth. I started with information instead of capital. I studied companies, learned about upcoming mergers and acquisitions, identified trends before they became obvious to the general market. What I didn't mention was how much of that early information came from sources that weren't entirely legal. The construction company where I worked as a bookkeeper did projects for several major corporations, and I developed a talent for reading between the lines of financial documents, for understanding what certain expenditures and budget allocations really meant. The first real money came from a stock tip, I continued. Apple Computer, 1982. I borrowed $500 against my car and bought shares at $22 each. Sold them 2 years later for over $100 per share. That's insider trading, Marcus said quietly. It was good research, I corrected, though his point wasn't entirely wrong. And it was the foundation for everything that came after. I'd taken the profits from that Apple investment and used them to fund more research, more strategic investments, and eventually, more sophisticated financial strategies. Shell companies established in business-friendly states. Offshore accounts in countries with favorable tax structures. Real estate purchased through limited liability companies that couldn't be traced back to Yvonne Garcia. Every major investment decision I made was designed to build generational wealth while maintaining complete privacy, I explained. I never wanted anyone to know how much money I was accumulating, because wealthy people become targets. For criminals, for government oversight, for family members who might not handle sudden wealth responsibly. The last comment hit its mark. I could see the recognition in their eyes, the understanding that I was talking about them. You didn't trust us, Melissa said, and for the first time, her voice carried hurt, rather than confusion. I didn't trust the situation, I corrected. I didn't trust what sudden knowledge of enormous wealth might do to your relationships, your work ethic, your sense of purpose. I've seen families destroyed by money, children who never learned to value anything because they never had to work for anything. So you let us worry about money instead? Marcus asked. You let us stress about college funds for our kids, about retirement savings, about whether we could afford to help you when we thought you needed it? The guilt I'd been carrying for years suddenly felt overwhelming. They were right, of course. My careful deception had protected them from the potential negative effects of inherited wealth. But it had also caused them genuine stress and worry about financial security. I established trust funds for all of you, I said quietly. You, Melissa, the grandchildren. The money becomes accessible when you turn 50, or earlier, under certain circumstances. You've never been in any real financial danger. Trust funds? Carmen looked like she was having trouble processing the information. How much money are we talking about? I pulled out another document from the first folder. Marcus, your trust currently contains about $15 million. Melissa, yours has about $12 million. The grandchildren each have educational trusts that will cover any college or graduate school expenses, plus enough for down payments on homes when they're older. The room fell silent, except for the sound of papers rustling as they examined the trust documents. I watched my children discover that they were millionaires, that their children's futures were already secured, that the financial worries they'd carried for years were based on incomplete information. "This is insane," Melissa said again, but this time her voice carried a different emotion. Not confusion or anger, but something approaching awe. "The total value of all assets," I said, "including real estate, investments, business holdings, and liquid accounts, is approximately $317 million as of last Friday's market close." $317 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence, too large to fully comprehend, too significant to ignore. Marcus set down the papers he'd been reading and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Mom, you're one of the richest people in California." "I'm one of the richest people in the country," I corrected. "And nobody knows it except the four of us and a handful of financial advisors who are bound by very strict confidentiality agreements." Carmen was shaking her head slowly. "Vonnie, this changes everything. Everything we thought we knew about you, about our family, about our future." "Does it?" I asked. "I'm still the same person I was an hour ago. I still love you all just as much. I still want what's best for everyone in this family." "But you lied to us," Melissa said. "For decades, you lied to us about who you really were." The accusation stung because it was accurate. I had lied, consistently and elaborately, about one of the most fundamental aspects of my identity. I'd let them believe I was struggling financially when I was actually more secure than they could have imagined. "I protected you," I said. "There's a difference." "Protected us from what?" Marcus asked. "From knowing that our mother was brilliant enough to build a fortune from nothing? From understanding that we never had to worry about money? From having the security of knowing that our family was financially stable?" When he put it that way, my reasoning sounded less noble and more selfish. Had I really been protecting them, or had I been protecting myself from having to explain how a bookkeeper from Riverside had accumulated wealth that rivaled tech billionaires? "I was protecting you from the responsibility," I said finally. "Wealth like this comes with obligations, expectations. People treat you differently when they know you have money. Relationships become complicated. I wanted you to become successful and confident on your own terms, not because you knew there was a safety net." "And what about now?" Carmen asked. "Why are you telling us now?" I gestured toward the assisted living brochures that still sat on my coffee table, their cheerful photographs now seeming almost absurd in light of what we just discussed. "Because you were about to stage an intervention based on the belief that I'm mentally declining and financially vulnerable," I said. "Because you were planning to take control of my finances to protect me from making mistakes. Because you thought I needed help managing money when I've actually been managing more money than most corporations for longer than you've been adults." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. They'd come here to save me from financial ruin, only to discover that I was wealthy enough to save entire communities from financial ruin. "So what happens now?" Melissa asked. It was the question I'd been asking myself for months. Ever since I'd realized this conversation was inevitable. What happened now that the truth was out? How did we move forward as a family when everything they thought they knew about me had changed? "Now," I said, "we figure out what comes next. Together." But even as I said the words, I could see the wheels turning in their minds. They were processing not just the revelation of my wealth, but all the implications that came with it. Their own financial futures, their children's opportunities, the possibilities that had just opened up for all of us. And I could see something else in their expressions, something that made my chest tighten with a familiar anxiety. They were looking at me differently already. The conversation continued for another 3 hours, covering everything from how I'd managed to hide such enormous wealth for so long, to what the revelation meant for our family's future. By the time we finally called it a day, my dining room table was covered with financial documents, trust fund paperwork, and investment statements that painted a picture of wealth accumulation so extensive it was difficult to comprehend. But as my children and daughter-in-law prepared to leave, promising to return the next day to continue our discussions, I found myself wondering if I'd made the right choice. The woman they'd thought they were helping was gone forever, replaced by someone they weren't sure they recognized. And I wasn't entirely certain that was a good thing. The week following our revelation felt like living in an alternate universe where all the familiar landmarks had been rearranged. My phone rang constantly, but now the calls weren't from concerned children checking on my well-being. Instead, they were strategy sessions, emotional processing conversations, and increasingly uncomfortable discussions about what my wealth meant for our family dynamics. Marcus called Tuesday morning while I was tending to my garden, the same modest vegetable patch I'd maintained for 20 years, despite being able to afford a team of professional landscapers. "Mom, I haven't slept since Saturday," he said without preamble. "Carmen and I have been talking nonstop about everything you told us, and I keep coming back to the same question. How could you let us struggle when you had the power to help?" I set down my gardening trowel and sat on the small bench I'd built myself from scrap wood, overlooking the tomato plants that had cost me $17 and triggered this entire chain of events. "Define struggle," I said carefully. "You know what I mean. The years when Carmen was working night shifts to help pay for nursing school while I was trying to get the construction business off the ground. The times we couldn't afford to take the kids on vacation, or when we had to choose between fixing the roof and replacing the water heater." His voice carried a weight I'd never heard before, a combination of hurt and confusion that made my chest ache. These were memories I'd tried not to think about, moments when I'd watched my children face financial stress while sitting on resources that could have eliminated their worries entirely. "You needed to build your own strength," I said, though the words sounded weak even to me. "You needed to know you could handle challenges, that you could succeed on your own merit." That's easy to say now, Mom. But do you have any idea what it's like to lie awake at night wondering if you're going to lose your house? To have your kids ask why other families can afford things you can't? I did know, actually. I remembered those feelings intimately from my own early years as a single mother, but I also remembered the strength and resourcefulness those challenges had forced me to develop, qualities that had ultimately enabled me to build the fortune we were now discussing. "Marcus, you and Carmen built a successful life together. You own your home, you have good jobs, your children are thriving in school. Would any of that feel as meaningful if you'd known there was a safety net the entire time?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Maybe not," he said. Finally, but it would have felt a lot less terrifying. After he hung up, I remained in my garden for another hour, pulling weeds and thinking about the delicate balance between protection and enablement that every parent struggled with. I'd chosen to protect my children from the potential corrupting influence of inherited wealth, but in doing so, I'd also denied them the security and peace of mind that financial stability could provide. Melissa's reaction was different but equally challenging. She arrived Thursday afternoon without calling first, something she'd never done before our conversation. When I opened the door, she was holding a manila folder that looked ominously similar to the one she'd brought the previous weekend. "We need to discuss the practical implications of Saturday's conversation," she said, brushing past me into the living room with the efficiency of someone conducting business rather than visiting family. "Good afternoon to you too," I said mildly. She didn't acknowledge the gentle sarcasm, instead spreading papers across my coffee table with the precision of a military operation. "I've been researching tax implications, estate planning strategies, and wealth management options. If what you told us is accurate, there are some serious legal and financial considerations we need to address immediately." I sat down across from her, noting that she was treating me more like a client than her mother. "Such as?" "Estate taxes, for starters. Without proper planning, the government could claim a significant portion of your assets when you die. Gift taxes, if you want to transfer wealth to us or the grandchildren while you're alive. Investment management fees that could be costing you hundreds of thousands of dollars annually if you're not with the right firms." She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd spent considerable time researching these topics, though I suspected her understanding was still superficial compared to the sophisticated strategies I'd been implementing for decades. "I have estate planning in place," I said. "What kind of estate planning? A simple will? A basic trust?" "Mom, we're talking about generational wealth here. You need international tax attorneys, offshore structuring specialists, family office management." The irony was that I'd been working with exactly those types of professionals for over 20 years. The difference was that they knew me by different names, operated through shell companies and trust structures that couldn't be easily traced back to the elderly woman sitting in a modest Riverside home. Melissa, I appreciate your concern, but I think you're underestimating how much thought I've put into these issues over the years. She looked at me with an expression that mixed frustration with something approaching pity. Mom, I don't think you understand how complex wealth management becomes at this level. The strategies that work for normal people don't apply when you're dealing with hundreds of millions of dollars. Normal people. The phrase stung more than I expected. In her mind, I had somehow transcended normalcy by accumulating wealth. But I still possessed the limited understanding of a normal person when it came to managing that wealth. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. I think we need to bring in professionals. Real professionals, not whoever you've been working with. Wealth managers from major firms, tax attorneys who specialize in high-net-worth families, financial advisors who understand international markets. The suggestion would have been laughable if it weren't so concerning. She wanted to bring in professionals to manage wealth that was already being managed by some of the most sophisticated financial minds in the world. But explaining that would require revealing the extent of my international financial network, the multiple identities I maintained, the complex web of legal entities that shielded my assets from exactly the kind of scrutiny she was proposing to invite. I'm not sure that's necessary, I said carefully. Mom, this isn't a conversation about what's necessary, this is about what's responsible. Her voice carried the same tone she'd used when lecturing me about my supposedly declining mental faculties. You have a responsibility to protect this wealth, not just for yourself but for all of us. For your grandchildren. Responsibility. The word had been following me through every conversation since Saturday's revelation. I had a responsibility, to be honest with my family, but also a responsibility to protect them from the complications that came with extreme wealth. I had a responsibility to manage my fortune wisely, but also a responsibility to maintain the privacy and security that had kept us all safe for decades. What if, I said slowly, the current management strategies are more sophisticated than you realize? She leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. What do you mean? I stood up and walked to my filing cabinet, the same one that had yielded such dramatic revelations the previous weekend. This time, I retrieved a different folder, one that contained information I'd never intended to share with anyone. These are my current wealth management arrangements, I said, setting the folder on the table between us. She opened it and began reading, her expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching shock. The documents showed a level of financial sophistication that most people never encountered, managed through firms and structures that operated in the shadows of the global financial system. Mom, these are offshore accounts. Shell companies in Delaware and Nevada. Cryptocurrency wallets in countries I've never heard of. Her voice rose with each item she identified. This isn't wealth management, this is financial hiding. It's asset protection, I corrected. And it's been keeping our family safe and financially secure for longer than you've been an adult. Safe from what? The IRS? The government? Law enforcement? She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. Mom, some of these arrangements look like money laundering. The accusation hit harder than I'd expected, partly because it touched on fears I'd carried for years. The line between sophisticated asset protection and illegal financial activity was thinner than most people realized, and I'd occasionally worried about which side of that line some of my strategies fell on. Everything I've done has been legal, I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true in every jurisdiction across every transaction over 4 decades. Legal and ethical aren't the same thing, she replied. And legal in one country doesn't mean legal everywhere. Mom, if the wrong people started investigating these arrangements, you could be in serious trouble. She wasn't wrong. The financial structures I'd built were designed to withstand casual scrutiny, but they wouldn't survive a determined investigation by sophisticated authorities. The multiple identities, the complex ownership structures, the international transfers that had built my fortune, all of it could be unraveled by someone with sufficient resources and motivation. That's why privacy has been so important, I explained. That's why I never wanted anyone to know about the money. Wealthy people become targets for investigation, litigation, criminal activity. The best protection is invisibility. But now we know, she said. Marcus knows, Carmen knows, I know. How long before other people figure it out? How long before the lifestyle changes start showing? How long before someone gets curious about how a retired bookkeeper in Riverside can afford things she shouldn't be able to afford? The questions echoed concerns that had been keeping me awake at night since Saturday. By revealing the truth to my family, I'd broken the cardinal rule that had protected us for decades. The secret that only I had known was now shared by 4 people, which meant it wasn't really a secret anymore. We'll have to be careful, I said. Careful isn't enough anymore, Mom. We need a plan. A real plan for how to handle this going forward. She gathered up the papers and closed the folder. And I think that plan needs to include bringing in legitimate professionals who can help us transition this wealth into proper, legal, transparent management structures. The word transparent sent a chill through me. Transparency was the enemy of the financial privacy that had enabled everything I'd built. Transparency meant scrutiny, investigation, and ultimately, the destruction of the carefully constructed system that had protected us for so long. I need time to think about this, I said. How much time? Because every day we wait is another day of potential exposure, another day of legal and financial risk. She stood up, her business-like demeanor softening slightly. Mom, I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for our family. But this situation is bigger than any of us can handle alone. After she left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of my carefully hidden life, wondering if the revelation I'd thought would solve our family's problems had actually created much larger ones. The call came that evening, just as I was finishing a dinner of leftover soup and thinking about how much my life had changed in less than a week. The number on my phone was one I recognized but hadn't seen in months. My offshore account manager calling from the Cayman Islands. Mrs. Patterson, he said, using one of the names I'd established decades earlier. We need to discuss some irregularities we've detected in recent account monitoring. My stomach dropped. David Chen was a professional who specialized in maintaining financial privacy for clients who valued discretion above all else. If he was calling about irregularities, it meant someone had been asking questions about my accounts. What kind of irregularities? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Database searches using your legal name, Yvonne Garcia. Credit monitoring requests. Background check inquiries. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news. It appears someone is investigating your financial history. Someone was investigating me. The timing couldn't be a coincidence. Within a week of revealing my wealth to my family, my carefully maintained financial privacy was already being compromised. Do you know who's conducting the investigation? I asked. The queries are coming through legitimate channels. Law firms, private investigation services, that sort of thing. But Mrs. Patterson, this level of scrutiny could pose significant risks to your asset protection strategies. Significant risks. In David's understated language, that meant the entire structure I'd built over 4 decades could be in jeopardy. What do you recommend? Immediate asset restructuring. We need to move quickly to establish new entities, transfer holdings to more secure jurisdictions, implement additional layers of privacy protection. He paused. This is going to be expensive and complex, but if someone is actively investigating your finances, we have a very narrow window to protect your interests. After I hung up, I sat in my darkened living room and tried to process what was happening. Someone was investigating my finances, which meant my revelation to my children had somehow triggered exactly the kind of scrutiny I'd spent decades avoiding. The question was who was investigating, and why? The answer came the next morning in the form of a certified letter that required my signature. The return address was from a law firm in Los Angeles that I'd never heard of, though the thick envelope and formal delivery method suggested something serious. Inside was a letter that made my blood run cold. Dear Ms. Garcia, it began, we represent clients who have reason to believe you may have information relevant to ongoing litigation regarding financial fraud and tax evasion schemes. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss these matters with you at your earliest convenience. Financial fraud and tax evasion, the 2 phrases that represented my worst nightmare. The accusations that could unravel everything I'd built and destroy not just my financial security, but my family's future. The letter was signed by an attorney named Robert Sterling, and it included a phone number with instructions to call within 5 business days to schedule a meeting. There was no indication of who his clients were or what specific information they thought I possessed, but the implications were clear. Someone knew about my hidden wealth, and they thought it was connected to illegal activity. I read the letter 3 times before the full implications began to sink in. This wasn't just a threat to my financial privacy. It was a potential criminal investigation that could result in federal charges, prison time, and the seizure of assets that I'd spent my entire adult life accumulating. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone to call Marcus. Whatever conflicts we'd been having about my financial decisions suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility that I might be facing prosecution for crimes I wasn't entirely sure I hadn't committed. "Marcus, I need you and Melissa to come over immediately," I said when he answered. "We have a problem, a big one." "What's wrong, Mom? You sound scared." Scared was an understatement. I was terrified in a way I hadn't been since those early years as a single mother when I'd worried about keeping food on the table and a roof over our heads. "Someone's investigating my finances," I said, "and they think I might be involved in fraud and tax evasion." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds before Marcus spoke again. "Mom, are you involved in fraud and tax evasion?" It was the question I'd been dreading, partly because I wasn't entirely sure how to answer it. I'd always told myself that everything I'd done was legal, that I was simply using sophisticated financial strategies that were available to anyone with sufficient knowledge and resources. But the line between aggressive tax avoidance and illegal evasion was often a matter of interpretation, and I'd occasionally crossed into gray areas that might not withstand aggressive scrutiny. "I've always tried to follow the law," I said, which was true but incomplete. "That's not really an answer, Mom." He was right, of course. But giving him a complete answer would require explaining financial strategies and ethical compromises that I wasn't sure he was prepared to understand. "Just come over," I said. "Bring Melissa. We need to figure out how to handle this." The next few hours felt like preparation for war. Marcus and Melissa arrived within an hour, both carrying the grim expressions of people who understood that our family was facing a crisis that could destroy everything we'd built together. I showed them the letter from the law firm, watched their faces change as they read the accusations and threats. By the time they finished, Melissa was pacing around my living room like a caged animal, while Marcus sat with his head in his hands. "This is exactly what I was worried about," Melissa said. "The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the hidden identities. It all looks suspicious to anyone who doesn't understand the full context." "What is the full context, Mom?" Marcus asked, looking up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "Because right now, from the outside, it looks like you've been running a sophisticated money laundering operation for decades." Money laundering. The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. I'd moved money through multiple entities and jurisdictions in ways specifically designed to obscure its origins and ownership. The fact that I'd been building wealth rather than stealing it might not matter to investigators who were focused on the methods rather than the motives. The context is that I was trying to build financial security for our family while protecting us from the kind of scrutiny that destroys wealthy families, I said. Everything I did was designed to keep us safe. "Safe from what?" Melissa asked. "Because right now, the biggest threat to our family's safety is coming from the very strategies you used to protect us." She was right, and the irony wasn't lost on me. The financial privacy that had protected us for decades was now the source of suspicion that could destroy us. "What do we do?" Marcus asked. It was the question I'd been asking myself since reading the lawyer's letter. My instinct was to run, to activate the escape plans I'd developed years earlier for exactly this scenario. I had resources in countries without extradition treaties, identities that could provide temporary sanctuary while I figured out how to rebuild elsewhere. But running would mean abandoning my family, leaving them to face whatever investigation was coming without the resources or knowledge they'd need to protect themselves. It would also mean accepting that everything I'd built over 4 decades was going to be lost. We hire the best criminal defense attorney we can find, I said finally. We prepare for the possibility that this investigation is serious. And we hope that 40 years of careful planning was enough to keep us all out of prison. The word prison hung in the air like a death sentence. None of us had ever imagined that our family's biggest crisis would involve the possibility of criminal prosecution, but that's exactly where we found ourselves. "Mom," Melissa said quietly, "is there anything else we need to know? Any other secrets? Any other risks we should be prepared for?" I looked at my children, these successful adults who'd built good lives without knowing about the fortune that had been accumulating in their names, and realized that despite everything I'd revealed in the past week, they still didn't know the full truth about who their mother really was, or what she'd been capable of. "There might be a few more things," I admitted. The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight and covered financial arrangements, legal strategies, and ethical compromises that I'd never intended to share with anyone. By the time my children left that night, they understood that their mother wasn't just wealthy. She was potentially a criminal defendant in a case that could result in decades of imprisonment and the seizure of hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. As I locked my door behind them and prepared for what might be my last night of freedom, I found myself wondering if the daughter who'd called me mentally gone had been more accurate than she'd realized. Maybe I had been mentally gone to think I could keep secrets this big for this long. Maybe I'd been mentally gone to believe that wealth built on deception could ever provide real security. And maybe I'd been mentally gone to think that protecting my family from the truth would somehow protect them from the consequences. But as I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of financial manipulation, I realized that being mentally gone might have been the only way to accumulate $300 million while living in a modest house in Riverside. The question now was whether that mental state had been brilliance or madness. I suspected I was about to find out. The criminal defense attorney I hired was nothing like the financial advisors I'd worked with over the decades. Where my offshore managers were discreet and spoke in careful euphemisms, Sandra Martinez was direct to the point of brutality. She sat across from me in her downtown Los Angeles office, reading through the documents I'd brought while occasionally making notes that seemed to carry the weight of judgment. "Mrs. Garcia," she said finally, setting down her pen and fixing me with a stare that made me feel like a defendant already, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to understand that your answer will determine how we proceed. Have you ever knowingly violated federal tax laws or engaged in financial fraud?" The question I'd been dreading for weeks. I'd spent sleepless nights trying to formulate an answer that was both honest and protective. But sitting in her sterile office with afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, I realized there was no safe way to respond. "I've always tried to minimize my tax burden using legal strategies," I said carefully. "That's not what I asked." Her voice carried the patience of someone who'd heard every possible evasion from clients who thought they were smarter than the legal system. "Have you ever filed false tax returns? Have you ever failed to report income? Have you ever used fraudulent identities to open accounts or conduct financial transactions?" Each question hit like a physical blow because the honest answer to all of them was yes. I'd filed tax returns that showed a fraction of my actual income. I'd failed to report earnings from offshore investments. I'd used carefully constructed false identities to establish accounts and entities that shielded my wealth from scrutiny. The financial strategies I employed were complex, I said, still trying to find a middle ground between honesty and self-incrimination. Sandra leaned back in her chair and studied me with the expression of someone who'd just confirmed her worst suspicions. "Mrs. Garcia, I've been practicing criminal defense for 25 years. I've represented everyone from small-time tax cheats to major financial criminals. What you've described to me isn't complex financial planning. It's textbook money laundering and tax evasion. Money laundering and tax evasion." Hearing the charges spoken aloud by someone who understood the legal system made them feel more real, more dangerous than they had when they'd existed only in my imagination. "What does that mean for my family?" I asked. "It means that if the government decides to prosecute, you're looking at decades in federal prison and the forfeiture of virtually everything you've accumulated over the past 40 years. She pulled out a legal pad and began writing. "It also means your children could face charges if they're found to have knowingly benefited from the proceeds of criminal activity. My children facing charges. The possibility hit me like a physical blow, partly because it was something I'd never considered in all my careful planning. I'd spent decades protecting them from the knowledge of my wealth specifically to shield them from any legal consequences, but their recent involvement in managing my assets could make them accessories after the fact. They didn't know, I said quickly. Marcus and Melissa had no idea about any of this until last week. That may protect them from conspiracy charges, but it won't protect them from asset forfeiture if the government determines that money in their trust funds came from criminal activity. Sandra made another note. Mrs. Garcia, I need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with. This isn't a civil tax dispute that can be resolved with penalties and interest. If they prosecute, they're going to seek maximum sentences and complete asset forfeiture. Complete asset forfeiture. The phrase echoed in my mind as I tried to process what it would mean for my family, not just the loss of the wealth I'd accumulated, but the destruction of the trust funds I'd established for my children and grandchildren, the college funds that would have secured their educational futures, the inheritance that was supposed to provide generational security. What are our options? I asked. Cooperation, she said without hesitation. If you're willing to provide information about other individuals or organizations involved in similar schemes, the government might be willing to negotiate reduced charges and asset forfeiture. I don't know about other people's schemes. I worked alone. Sandra raised an eyebrow. Mrs. Garcia, nobody accumulates $300 million in offshore accounts without help. Financial advisors, bankers, accountants, lawyers. Someone helped you set up these structures. The government is going to want names. Names. I thought about David Chen in the Cayman Islands. About the Swiss banker who'd helped me establish my European holdings. About the Delaware attorney who'd created dozens of shell companies over the years. These were professionals who'd provided services to hundreds of clients. People who'd trusted me to maintain the same confidentiality I'd demanded from them. I can't give them names, I said. Then you're looking at the maximum penalties for every charge they decide to file. She closed the legal pad and leaned forward. Mrs. Garcia, I understand loyalty, but you need to consider what's more important: protecting people who provided you with illegal services, or protecting your family from complete financial ruin. The drive back to Riverside felt like traveling through a landscape that had fundamentally changed while I wasn't paying attention. The familiar strip malls and residential neighborhoods looked the same, but I experienced them now as someone whose freedom might be measured in weeks rather than years. Every police car I passed made my pulse spike. Every government building reminded me of courthouses and federal prisons. Marcus and Melissa were waiting when I arrived home, their faces carrying the strain of people who'd spent the day contemplating their mother's potential imprisonment. Carmen had driven down from Phoenix again, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes that came from trying to support a family through a crisis that defied all normal experience. What did the lawyer say? Melissa asked before I'd even closed the front door. I sat down in my recliner, the same chair where I'd revealed my wealth 2 weeks earlier, and tried to find words for news that would shatter whatever hope they'd been maintaining. She thinks the government has a strong case for money laundering and tax evasion charges, I said. If they decide to prosecute, I could be facing decades in prison and complete forfeiture of all assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus sat with his head in his hands, while Melissa stared at me with an expression that mixed horror with something approaching anger. All assets? Carmen asked quietly. Including the trust funds? I nodded. Including everything. The house, the investments, the trust funds, the college accounts for the grandchildren. If they determine that the money came from criminal activity, they can seize all of it. This is insane, Melissa said, her voice rising. You spent 40 years building this fortune, and now you're telling us it could all disappear because of how you built it? The government doesn't care about intentions, I replied. They care about methods. And according to Sandra, my methods constitute serious federal crimes. Marcus looked up, his face pale. Mom, what did you actually do? I mean specifically, because we keep talking about complex financial strategies and offshore accounts. But if you're facing decades in prison, you must have done something seriously illegal. It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one that required me to admit the full extent of my deception not just to my family, but to myself. For 40 years, I'd told myself that I was simply being aggressive about tax minimization and asset protection. But facing the possibility of federal prosecution forced me to confront the reality of what I'd actually been doing. I used false identities to open accounts and establish businesses, I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. I failed to report income from offshore investments. I moved money through shell companies, specifically to hide its origins and ownership. I filed tax returns that understated my actual wealth by hundreds of millions of dollars. Each admission felt like a confession in a church where absolution wasn't possible. My children listened with expressions that shifted from shock to disappointment, to something approaching grief. As if they were mourning the mother they'd thought they knew. "How could you do that?" Melissa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could you live with that level of deception for decades?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since the investigation began. How had I justified such elaborate fraud to myself for so long? How had I convinced myself that the ends justified the means, when the means involved systematic violations of laws designed to prevent exactly the kind of activity I'd been engaged in? I told myself I was protecting our family, I said. I told myself that the system was unfair, that wealthy people used these strategies all the time, that I was just leveling the playing field. But you weren't just using strategies that wealthy people use, Marcus said. You were committing crimes that wealthy people hire lawyers to help them avoid committing. He was right, of course. The difference between aggressive tax avoidance and criminal tax evasion often came down to disclosure and intent. Wealthy families employed teams of professionals to minimize their tax burden while staying within legal boundaries. I'd simply ignored those boundaries entirely. "What happens now?" Carmen asked. "Sandra wants me to consider cooperation," I said. "Providing information about other people involved in similar schemes in exchange for reduced charges and asset forfeiture." "What kind of information?" Melissa asked. "Names of financial advisors, bankers, lawyers who helped me set up the offshore structures. Details about how these systems work, who else might be using them. And if you don't cooperate? Maximum penalties for every charge they file. Complete asset forfeiture. Decades in federal prison." The room fell silent again as we all contemplated a future where the family patriarch was serving a life sentence for financial crimes, while the fortune she'd spent her life building was distributed to government coffers. "There's something else," I said, knowing that I needed to share the most difficult part of Sandra's assessment. "She thinks you might face charges too if they can prove you knowingly benefited from criminal proceeds." "We just found out about the money 2 weeks ago," Marcus protested. "But you've been managing it since then, making decisions about investments, discussing how to structure the wealth going forward. If they can argue that you knew the money came from illegal activity and continued to benefit from it, they could charge you as accessories." The implications hit them like a physical blow. Not only was their mother facing prosecution for crimes they'd never imagined her committing, but they might be drawn into the case themselves simply by virtue of learning about her activities. "This keeps getting worse," Melissa said, slumping back in her chair. "Every time we think we understand the scope of the problem, it gets bigger." She wasn't wrong. What had started as a family intervention about my supposedly declining mental faculties had evolved into a criminal investigation that threatened to destroy not just my freedom, but my children's futures as well. "What does Sandra recommend?" Marcus asked. "Cooperation and plea bargaining. Give them everything they want to know about offshore financial networks, in exchange for reduced sentences and partial asset forfeiture." "How partial?" "She thinks we might be able to keep 10 to 20% of the assets if I provide substantial assistance to ongoing investigations." 10 to 20% of $300 million was still significant wealth by any normal standard, but it represented the destruction of 90% of everything I'd spent my life building. More importantly, it would require me to betray the trust of dozens of professionals who'd provided services based on expectations of confidentiality. "We need time to think about this," Marcus said. "We don't have much time," I replied. "The lawyer who sent the initial letter wants a response within 2 business days. If I don't contact him, he's going to assume I'm not cooperating and recommend that his clients proceed with formal complaints to federal authorities. 2 business days to decide whether to surrender my freedom and fortune or fight charges that could result in a life sentence." 2 days to choose between betraying people who'd trusted me or watching my family face prosecution for crimes they hadn't committed. That night, after my children had returned to their hotel, I sat in my garden under a sky clearer than any I'd seen in months. The vegetables I'd planted in spring were reaching harvest time, tomatoes and peppers and herbs that had grown while my world had been collapsing around me. There was something profoundly ironic about tending to plants that cost pennies while contemplating the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Patterson, urgent communication required regarding recent developments. Please call immediately." Mrs. Patterson was one of the identities I'd used for offshore accounts, a name known only to a handful of financial professionals who operated in the shadows of international banking. Receiving a message addressed to that identity on my personal phone meant that my carefully maintained separation between my public and private financial lives had been completely compromised. I called the number, though I suspected I already knew what I was going to hear. "Mrs. Patterson?" The voice belonged to David Chen, though he sounded more stressed than I'd ever heard him. "We have a serious problem. Multiple government agencies are making inquiries about your accounts. American authorities, British financial intelligence, Swiss banking regulators. The confidentiality that protected your assets is being systematically dismantled. How long do we have?" I asked. "Days, maybe weeks, before they have enough information to begin seizure proceedings." "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you directly. Have you disclosed your offshore holdings to anyone recently?" The question I'd been dreading. David's services had been predicated on absolute secrecy, and I'd just violated that fundamental principle by revealing my wealth to my family. "There may have been some disclosure," I said carefully. "To whom?" "Family members." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Mrs. Patterson," he said finally, "family disclosure in cases like this almost always leads to government disclosure, either through investigation of family members or through voluntary cooperation by family members who don't understand the legal implications of what they've learned. My children wouldn't cooperate with investigators without telling me," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. Perhaps not intentionally, but if they're questioned by federal agents, if they're threatened with prosecution themselves, if they're offered immunity in exchange for information, family loyalty has limits when personal freedom is at stake. He was right, of course. I'd placed my children in an impossible position by revealing wealth they couldn't have legally, then expecting them to maintain secrecy that could make them accessories to federal crimes. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Immediate asset restructuring and relocation. We can move liquid holdings to jurisdictions without extradition treaties, establish new identities in countries that don't cooperate with American law enforcement. But, Mrs. Patterson, this would require you to disappear from your current life entirely." Disappear from my current life entirely. The phrase echoed in my mind as I contemplated what it would mean to abandon everything familiar, my home, my community, my family, to preserve wealth that had already cost me more than I'd ever intended to pay. "How long would I have to stay gone?" I asked. "Forever. Once you activate this kind of escape plan, there's no returning to your previous identity. Mrs. Patterson would have to become your permanent reality." Forever. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a life where I never saw my children or grandchildren again, where I lived under a false identity in a foreign country, where the fortune I'd built to protect my family became the reason I had to abandon them. "I need to think about this," I said. "Don't think too long," David replied. "Every day you delay is another day closer to asset seizure and criminal prosecution." After I hung up, I remained in my garden until the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. 40 years of careful planning had brought me to a moment where every option available was a form of surrender. I could cooperate with authorities and betray the professionals who trusted me, watching 90% of my wealth disappear in exchange for a reduced prison sentence. I could fight the charges and risk spending the rest of my life in federal prison while my family faced prosecution for association with my activities. Or I could disappear entirely, preserving my wealth but losing my family forever. None of these were the outcomes I'd envisioned when I'd started building my hidden empire in 1981. The next morning brought news that made the decision unavoidable. Marcus called while I was making coffee, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Mom, federal agents came to my house this morning. They want to interview Carmen and me about your financial activities. They said we could either cooperate voluntarily or they'd subpoena us to testify before a grand jury." Federal agents at my son's house. The investigation had moved beyond exploratory inquiries to active law enforcement action, which meant I was out of time for careful consideration of options. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That we needed to consult with an attorney before agreeing to any interviews." "But Mom, they made it very clear that this is a serious criminal investigation and that our cooperation would be viewed favorably when they decide whether to file charges against us. Charges against my children. The possibility I'd spent 4 decades trying to prevent was now imminent, unless I took action to protect them." "Did they say what specific charges they're considering?" I asked. "Money laundering, conspiracy to commit tax evasion, and something called structuring financial transactions to avoid reporting requirements." Marcus's voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "Mom, they seem to know details about accounts and transactions that we never discussed. They're not fishing for information. They already have it. They already had the information they needed to prosecute." Which meant my choices had narrowed to cooperation or flight, with fighting no longer a viable option. I made my decision that afternoon, sitting in Sandra Martinez's office, with sunlight streaming through the same windows where I'd first learned the scope of my legal jeopardy. "I'll cooperate," I said. "Full disclosure, complete cooperation, whatever they need to protect my children from prosecution." Sandra nodded as if she'd expected this outcome. "What about the asset forfeiture?" "If cooperation can protect my family, I'll accept whatever financial consequences are necessary." "Mrs. Garcia, you need to understand that cooperation is going to require you to reveal information that could implicate dozens of other people. Financial advisors, bankers, attorneys who helped you establish these structures. Are you prepared for that level of disclosure?" I thought about David Chen in the Cayman Islands, about the Swiss banker who'd managed my European investments, about the Delaware attorney who'd created the shell companies that had protected my wealth for decades. These were professionals who'd provided services based on expectations of confidentiality, people who trusted me to maintain the same discretion I'd demanded from them. "Yes," I said. "I'm prepared." The cooperation agreement I signed the following week was 47 pages of legal language that essentially traded my wealth and freedom for my children's protection. In exchange for providing complete information about offshore financial networks, I received a plea agreement that reduced my potential sentence from decades to 18 months in federal prison. The asset forfeiture settlement allowed my family to retain approximately $30 million of the original $300 million, enough to ensure comfortable futures while eliminating the vast fortune I'd spent my life accumulating. The information I provided to federal investigators led to prosecutions of financial professionals across 3 continents, and the seizure of assets belonging to dozens of other families who'd employed similar wealth-hiding strategies. I became what law enforcement called a, quote, high-value quoting witness, someone whose testimony was crucial to dismantling international financial networks that had facilitated tax evasion and money laundering for wealthy individuals across the globe. My children were never charged with any crimes. The trust funds I'd established in their names were restructured to comply with federal tax laws, providing them with legitimate wealth, while eliminating any taint of criminal proceeds. Marcus returned to his construction business in Phoenix, while Melissa continued her real estate career in Newport Beach, both of them carrying the knowledge that their financial security had come at the cost of their mother's freedom and reputation. I was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and community service. The judge who pronounced my sentence noted that while my cooperation had been valuable to law enforcement, the scope and duration of my financial crimes required significant punishment to deter others from similar activities. Federal prison was nothing like the violent, dangerous environment I'd feared. Most of my fellow inmates were white-collar criminals, executives who'd embezzled corporate funds, accountants who'd helped clients evade taxes, investment advisors who'd operated Ponzi schemes. We were housed in a minimum security facility that resembled a college campus more than a traditional prison, with dormitory-style housing and work programs designed to prepare inmates for reintegration into society. I spent my time in prison working in the library, helping other inmates prepare legal documents and appeals. The irony wasn't lost on me that the research skills I'd developed while building my hidden fortune were now being used to help people navigate the legal consequences of their own financial crimes. Marcus and Melissa visited monthly, making the drive from their respective cities to spend awkward hours in a visiting room that somehow made normal conversation impossible. We talked about their children, about changes in their neighborhoods, about anything except the events that had brought us to that sterile government facility. Carmen came occasionally, bringing updates about my grandchildren's activities and achievements, treating me with the same professional kindness she'd shown during my medical appointments in the years before my world collapsed. The hardest part of incarceration wasn't the loss of freedom or privacy. It was watching my family struggle to reconcile the grandmother and mother they'd known with the criminal defendant I'd become. They loved me, I knew that, but they also couldn't quite understand how the woman who'd raised them to be honest and responsible had spent decades engaged in systematic deception and fraud. I was released after 15 months for good behavior, emerging into a world that had moved on without me. My modest house in Riverside had been sold to pay legal fees and restitution, so I moved into a small apartment in a senior living community in Palm Springs. The irony of ending up in exactly the kind of assisted living facility my children had wanted to move me into wasn't lost on me, though the circumstances were quite different from what any of us had imagined. The $30 million my family had been allowed to retain from the original fortune provided comfortable security for all of us, but it was managed through legitimate financial advisors under court supervision. No more offshore accounts, no more shell companies, no more false identities. Just straightforward investments that generated modest returns while complying fully with federal tax laws. My relationship with my children slowly began to rebuild, though it was fundamentally different from what it had been before my revelations. They saw me now as someone capable of deception on a scale they'd never imagined, which meant they approached every conversation with a level of caution that hadn't existed before. Trust, once broken by decades of lies, proved nearly impossible to fully repair, but we found ways to move forward. Marcus and his family visited regularly, bringing my grandchildren to swim in the community pool and walk the desert trails that surrounded my new home. Melissa called weekly, sharing updates about her business and her social life, carefully avoiding topics that might lead to discussions about money or legal troubles. On Sundays, we often gathered for dinner at restaurants in Palm Springs, 3 generations of a family that had survived financial crimes, federal prosecution, and the destruction of a fortune that most people couldn't even imagine. The conversations were lighter now, focused on immediate concerns, rather than the complex financial strategies that had once dominated my thoughts. Sometimes, as I watched my grandchildren play while their parents discussed mortgage rates or vacation plans, I wondered if I'd made the right choices. Would my family have been better off if I'd never accumulated the wealth that had ultimately brought us so much trouble? Would my children have been happier with the financial struggles I'd tried to spare them from? But then I remembered the trust funds that would help my grandchildren attend college without debt, the down payment assistance that had allowed Marcus and Carmen to buy their dream home, the financial security that meant none of them would ever face the kind of desperation that had driven me to commit crimes in the first place. My daughter had called me mentally gone for spending $17 on organic tomatoes while struggling to pay bills. She'd been right about my mental state, though not in the way she'd imagined. I had been mentally gone in the direction of obsessive financial planning, gone in the direction of wealth accumulation at any cost, gone in the direction of deceptions so elaborate that it had consumed decades of my life. But I'd also been mental enough to build a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars while living in a modest house in Riverside. Mental enough to hide that fortune for 40 years while maintaining the appearance of an elderly woman struggling on a fixed income. Mental enough to cooperate with federal authorities in a way that protected my family from prosecution, while accepting personal responsibility for crimes that could have destroyed all of us. The morning I received my final letter from federal probation, officially concluding my supervised release and restoring my full citizenship rights, I sat in my small apartment overlooking the San Jacinto Mountains and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. I was 75 years old, living on a modest income from legitimate investments, surrounded by a family that loved me despite understanding the full scope of my capacity for deception. My grandchildren knew me as the grandmother who'd served time in federal prison for financial crimes, but who helped them with their homework and took them to movies on Saturday afternoons. It wasn't the ending I'd planned when I'd started building my hidden empire, but it was an ending that preserved what mattered most: my family's security and our relationships with each other. The fortune was gone, but the people I'd accumulated it for were safe and financially stable. That afternoon, I received a call from Marcus with news that his oldest daughter had been accepted to Stanford University with a partial scholarship. The trust fund I'd established years earlier would cover the remaining costs, ensuring that she could pursue her education without the financial constraints that had limited my own opportunities decades earlier. "Thank you, Mom," he said simply, "for everything you did and everything you sacrificed to make this possible." It was the first time since my arrest that one of my children had acknowledged the positive aspects of what I'd built, rather than focusing solely on the criminal methods I'd used to build it. The gratitude in his voice reminded me that despite the legal consequences and personal costs, my decades of financial planning had achieved their ultimate goal, providing security for the people I loved most. That evening, as I prepared dinner in my small kitchen, I smiled to myself, thinking about how much my life had changed. The woman who'd once controlled hundreds of millions of dollars was now carefully budgeting for groceries. But she was also free from the constant fear of discovery that had shadowed her for 40 years. My daughter had been right. I had been mentally gone. But sometimes being mentally gone was exactly what the situation required. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.